Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Katie's fury did not arrive gently or with any warning that might have allowed the room to brace itself. It erupted like a rupture deep inside her chest, a violent surge of emotion that had been building for far too long, fed by betrayal, fear, exhaustion, and the aching sense that every truth she thought she could rely on had been quietly dismantled by the one person she never expected to wound her this deeply. And when she finally yelled those 5 shocking words at Brooke, the sound was not merely a shout but a raw, visceral tearing from somewhere close to her heart, as though her body itself could no longer contain the weight of what she had been holding back, and in that moment the air seemed to freeze, thick with disbelief, because those words were not just an accusation or an insult, they were a verdict, a declaration that something precious had broken beyond easy repair, and Brooke stood there stunned, her face draining of color as she tried to process the force behind them. Realizing too late that this confrontation was not a simple argument but the culmination of weeks, maybe months, of suppressed rage and unspoken hurt, all of it now spilling out in one devastating outburst that pushed Katie to the very edge of her endurance. Katie's heart, already strained by the emotional toll of constant stress and unrelenting disappointment, began to betray her physically as well. Her breathing growing shallow and uneven as adrenaline surged through her system, each heartbeat pounding violently as if it were protesting the abuse it had been subjected to for so long, and yet she could not stop, could not slow herself down, because the anger had taken control, driving her forward with reckless momentum, her voice rising again and again as she hurled the truth she had been carrying like a weapon sharpened by pain, each word landing with brutal precision. Each sentence another crack in the fragile space between them, and Brooke, still frozen, could only stare. Caught between guilt and shock, as the realization dawned that she was witnessing not just anger but collapse, the kind that happens when someone has been strong for too long without relief. The room seemed to close in around them as Katie's emotions spiraled, rage bleeding into fear, fear into despair, until her entire body trembled under the strain. And in that trembling was the terrifying hint that her heart might not be able to take much more, that the stress she was under was no longer metaphorical but dangerously real, a physical threat looming behind every furious breath and every sharp word. The confrontation, once merely emotional, became something far more serious as Katie clutched at her chest mid-yell, the pain sudden and shocking enough to slice through her anger, her face contorting not with fury now but with panic. Because in that instant she could feel how close she was to the breaking point, how thin the line had become between expressing her pain and being consumed by it, and Brooke's stunned silence cracked at last as fear replaced defensiveness, her mind racing with the horrifying possibility that this argument, this moment of betrayal and rage, might end in something irreversible. Yet even as concern flickered across Brooke's face, Katie's sense of betrayal burned too hot to be extinguished so easily, and she continued, her voice hoarse, every syllable dragged up from deep inside, explaining through accusation and anguish how deeply she had been hurt, how every promise broken had chipped away at her trust until there was nothing left but this explosive confrontation, this moment where everything was at risk, including her own health, and the irony of it all seemed almost cruel, that the person who had caused her so much emotional damage was now the one standing there watching her unravel, powerless to undo what had already been done. As Katie's anger sparked this devastating collapse, it became clear that this was not just about one lie or one mistake but about a pattern of betrayal that had left her feeling unsafe, unheard, and utterly alone, and the fear that crept in alongside her chest pain was not just fear for her body but fear that she had reached a place where she no longer recognized herself, where rage had overridden reason and the consequences of that loss of control could be catastrophic. Brooke, finally stepping forward, tried to speak. Tried to apologize, but the words felt small and inadequate against the magnitude of Katie's pain, and Katie recoiled, not wanting comfort, not wanting excuses, only wanting the agony to stop, yet unable to make it stop on her own, her heart racing wildly as if echoing the chaos in her mind. This was the breaking point everyone had feared but hoped would never come, the moment when suppressed emotions detonated with enough force to threaten not just relationships but life itself. And as Katie staggered, her anger dissolving into raw terror, it became horrifyingly clear that everything truly was at risk now, that this confrontation had crossed a line from dramatic to dangerous, and the room held its breath as the consequences of rage, betrayal, and fear collided in one unbearable instant, leaving Brooke stunned, shaken, and confronted with the devastating reality that her actions had pushed Katie beyond what her heart could handle, that this explosive yell, those 5 shocking words, might echo forever as the moment when everything changed. When anger became collapse, when love turned to betrayal, and when a furious confrontation revealed just how fragile the human heart can be when it is pushed to the edge for far too long. The aftermath of that explosive moment did not arrive with clarity or resolution but instead unfolded in slow, agonizing waves, each second stretching unbearably long as Katie struggled to remain upright, her body no longer obeying the fierce determination that had carried her through the confrontation, because now the adrenaline was draining away, leaving behind a frightening vulnerability that she could no longer mask with anger, and the room, once charged with her rage, became heavy with dread as Brooke rushed forward, her earlier shock replaced by raw panic, realizing that words, no matter how sincere or remorseful, were useless in the face of what was happening, that this was no longer about pride, betrayal, or even forgiveness, but about whether Katie could endure the toll this emotional storm had taken on her heart. Katie's breaths came in short, jagged gasps, each one scraping through her chest as though her lungs themselves were protesting the strain, and with every heartbeat that thundered erratically inside her, fear tightened its grip, because she could feel how close she was to losing control entirely, how the strength she had relied on for so long had finally given way, leaving her exposed in a way she had never allowed herself to be before, and that exposure was terrifying, stripping her down to the truth she had tried so desperately to avoid. That she was hurt far more deeply than she had ever admitted, and that the pain of betrayal had seeped into every part of her life, weakening her from the inside out. Brooke's voice trembled as she called Katie's name, the sound barely cutting through the fog of pain and panic clouding Katie's mind, and when Katie finally looked at her, the fury that had once blazed in her eyes was gone, replaced by something far more unsettling, a hollow fear mixed with exhaustion. The look of someone who had fought for too long and finally reached the limits of her endurance, and in that look Brooke saw the full weight of what she had done, not just the argument or the lies but the cumulative damage of every moment when Katie had felt dismissed, deceived, or taken for granted. Time seemed distorted as Katie sank down, her knees buckling beneath her, and Brooke caught her just in time, the physical closeness starkly different from the emotional distance that had driven them apart, and for a brief, fragile moment, everything else faded away, the accusations, the anger, the 5 shocking words, leaving only the frightening reality of a heart pushed beyond its breaking point. Katie's thoughts scattered as dizziness washed over her, memories and regrets tangling together in a painful blur, and she wondered dimly how it had come to this, how the person she had once trusted so completely had become the catalyst for such devastation, and whether this collapse was not just physical but symbolic, representing the end of something she had once believed was unbreakable. Brooke fumbled for her phone with shaking hands, torn between staying close to Katie and the urgent need to call for help, guilt gnawing at her with relentless intensity as she whispered apologies that felt painfully inadequate, her voice cracking under the realization that she might lose Katie not because of fate or illness alone but because of choices she herself had made, choices that had accumulated silently until they erupted in this catastrophic way. Katie drifted in and out of awareness, each heartbeat a reminder of how fragile she suddenly felt, how vulnerable anger had left her, and in those moments of semi-consciousness she grappled with conflicting emotions, resentment still burning faintly, fear dominating everything else, and beneath it all a deep, aching sadness for what had been lost, because even now, even in this moment of crisis, she could not entirely extinguish the pain of betrayal, could not simply forgive and forget. No matter how desperately her body now needed peace, the sound of sirens in the distance eventually cut through the suffocating silence, grounding the scene in harsh reality, and as help arrived, the weight of what had happened settled heavily over everything, transforming the confrontation from an emotional climax into a reckoning that neither of them could escape. Because this was no longer a private argument or a dramatic outburst but a turning point with consequences that would linger long after the echoes of raised voices had faded. As Katie was carefully lifted and attended to, Brooke hovered nearby, her hands trembling, her mind replaying every moment that had led up to this, every missed sign, every dismissed concern, every time she had assumed Katie would be fine because she always had been before, only now confronted with the terrifying truth that resilience has limits, and that pushing someone beyond them can have irreversible consequences. The sterile brightness of the emergency room later stood in stark contrast to the raw emotional chaos that had preceded it, and as Katie lay there, surrounded by machines that monitored the rhythm of her heart, she felt an overwhelming sense of vulnerability wash over her, the anger that had fueled her collapse now replaced by a quiet, haunting fear of what might happen next, of what this moment meant for her future, her health, and her relationship with Brooke, because no matter what happened from here on out, things could never return to the way they were before. Brooke sat nearby, silent now, her earlier defensiveness completely stripped away, left only with regret and a desperate hope that Katie would recover, that she would be given another chance to make things right, though deep down she understood that survival alone would not magically erase the damage that had been done, that trust once shattered cannot simply be willed back into existence. As hours passed and the immediate danger slowly eased, a heavy stillness settled between them, filled with unspoken questions and unresolved pain, and Katie, staring up at the ceiling, felt a strange clarity emerge through the exhaustion. A realization that this collapse, as terrifying as it had been, might also be a moment of reckoning she could no longer avoid, forcing her to confront not only Brooke's betrayal but her own tendency to endure too much for too long, to silence her needs until they exploded in destructive ways. The fear that had seized her heart lingered, but alongside it grew a fragile determination to protect herself moving forward, to recognize that no relationship, no matter how deeply rooted, was worth sacrificing her health or her sense of self, and that realization, painful as it was, carried with it the possibility of change, of boundaries, of choosing survival over silence. Brooke, watching Katie breathe steadily at last, felt the full weight of that potential change, sensing that even if Katie recovered physically, the emotional landscape between them had been irrevocably altered, and that the road ahead, if there was one at all, would be long, uncertain, and demanding, requiring more than apologies or promises but genuine accountability and transformation. The confrontation that had begun with rage and ended in collapse thus became something far larger than either of them had anticipated, a stark reminder of how quickly emotions can spiral into physical danger, how betrayal can erode not just trust but health, and how the human heart, both metaphorically and literally, can only withstand so much before it demands to be heard, leaving behind stunned silence, lingering fear, and the haunting knowledge that everything had come terrifyingly close to being lost forever. In the days that followed, the world seemed to move on with a cruel normalcy that felt deeply disconnected from what Katie was experiencing internally, because while the monitors had eventually steadied and the doctors spoke in careful, reassuring tones about stress-induced cardiac episodes and the importance of rest, nothing about her felt settled or safe, and each quiet moment left too much room for memory and reflection, forcing her to relive the confrontation over and over again, the sound of her own voice raised beyond recognition, the shock on Brooke's face, and the terrifying instant when anger gave way to pain and fear, a reminder that what had happened could not be undone or minimized, no matter how desperately either of them might want that. Lying alone in the hospital room at night, the dim lights casting long shadows across the walls, Katie found herself grappling with a new kind of exhaustion, one that went far deeper than physical fatigue, because now that the rage had burned itself out, she was left with the raw aftermath, grief for what had been lost, fear of what might still happen, and an aching awareness that she had ignored her own limits for far too long in the name of keeping the peace and preserving a relationship that had quietly been draining her strength. Brooke visited often, sometimes sitting silently at Katie's bedside, sometimes speaking in soft, halting sentences filled with remorse, but no matter how sincere those apologies sounded, there was an invisible barrier between them now, a tension that neither of them quite knew how to cross, because the collapse had changed the rules of their dynamic in a way that could not be ignored. Katie listened, but she did not respond the way she once might have, with immediate reassurance or an instinctive urge to smooth things over, because something inside her had shifted, leaving her more guarded, more aware of how dangerous it had been to prioritize understanding someone else over protecting herself. Each time Brooke reached for her hand, Katie hesitated before accepting the contact, and in that hesitation was a truth that both of them felt but rarely acknowledged out loud. Whatever trust had once existed between them was now fragile, fractured by betrayal and nearly destroyed by the consequences of that explosive confrontation. As Katie regained physical strength, the emotional reckoning only grew heavier, because recovery brought clarity rather than relief, and with clarity came questions she could no longer avoid. She asked herself how long she had been suppressing her anger, how many moments she had dismissed as insignificant when they had actually been warning signs, and how easily she had convinced herself that enduring pain was simply part of loving someone deeply. Those questions were uncomfortable and unsettling, forcing her to confront patterns she had normalized for years, patterns that had culminated in her heart quite literally crying out under the strain. It became impossible to ignore the connection between her emotional state and her physical health, and that realization frightened her almost as much as the collapse itself, because it meant she could no longer separate what she felt from what her body endured. The doctor spoke to her about stress management, about boundaries, about the importance of listening to her body, and while their words were clinical and carefully measured, they echoed what Katie had already begun to understand on her own, that anger does not disappear when it is ignored, that betrayal does not lose its power simply because it goes unaddressed, and that the human heart, both emotionally and physically, cannot survive indefinitely under constant pressure. Each conversation reinforced the gravity of what had happened, transforming the confrontation with Brooke into a defining moment rather than an isolated incident, and Katie sensed that the choices she made next would shape not only her recovery but her future. When she was finally discharged and returned home, the familiar surroundings felt strangely foreign, as though she were seeing her life from a distance for the first time, and that distance gave her perspective she had never allowed herself before. Everyday objects became reminders of the emotional weight she had been carrying, the couch where she had sat quietly swallowing her frustration, the kitchen where she had smiled through disappointment, the bedroom where she had lain awake at night replaying conversations she wished she had handled differently. These spaces held memories not just of happiness but of compromise and silence, and Katie realized that healing would require more than rest and medication. It would require confronting the life she had been living and deciding whether it was sustainable. Brooke, sensing the shift, tried to be attentive in new ways, offering help, suggesting conversations, expressing a willingness to change, but Katie approached those gestures with cautious skepticism, because while she wanted to believe in the possibility of repair, she could no longer afford blind faith. She needed actions rather than promises, consistency rather than apologies, and even then, she was uncertain whether the damage could truly be undone. The collapse had stripped away her illusions, revealing how close she had come to losing everything, including herself, and that awareness made her reluctant to rush back into old patterns, no matter how familiar or comforting they might have once felt. There were moments, especially in the quiet hours of early morning, when fear crept back in, whispering doubts about her strength and her ability to navigate what lay ahead, and in those moments Katie placed a hand over her chest, feeling the steady rhythm of her heart as both reassurance and warning. Each beat reminded her that she had been given another chance, that survival carried responsibility, and that honoring that responsibility meant making difficult, sometimes painful decisions. She began journaling, pouring her thoughts onto paper in an attempt to untangle the mess of emotions inside her, and through that process she discovered anger she had never fully acknowledged, sadness she had minimized, and a deep yearning for peace that had nothing to do with avoiding conflict and everything to do with feeling safe and respected. Conversations with Brooke gradually shifted as well, becoming less about fixing things immediately and more about understanding the depth of what had gone wrong, and while those conversations were tense and emotionally draining, they were also revealing, exposing differences in perception and expectation that had long been glossed over. Katie spoke more openly now, refusing to soften her words or retreat into silence, and though doing so sometimes led to discomfort and friction, it also brought a sense of relief she had not felt in years, because for the first time she was honoring her own truth without apology. Brooke listened, sometimes defensively, sometimes with genuine remorse, and the outcome of those exchanges remained uncertain, suspended between the possibility of growth and the reality that some wounds do not heal simply because both parties wish they would. As weeks passed, Katie's strength continued to return, but she remained acutely aware that recovery was not linear, that progress did not erase vulnerability, and that one intense emotional trigger could undo much of what she had rebuilt if she was not careful. This awareness made her more deliberate in how she engaged with the world, more selective about where she invested her energy, and more willing to step back when something felt wrong rather than pushing through it at her own expense. Friends noticed the change, describing her as calmer but more resolute, less inclined to absorb other people's chaos, and Katie recognized in those observations the beginnings of a self she had neglected for far too long. The confrontation that had once felt like the worst moment of her life slowly began to take on a different meaning, not as something to be erased or forgotten but as a turning point that demanded accountability, honesty, and change. It remained painful to think about, especially the knowledge that it had taken a physical collapse to force that reckoning, but Katie also understood that without it, she might have continued down the same destructive path until the consequences were far more severe. That understanding did not absolve Brooke of responsibility or magically heal the betrayal, but it did give Katie a sense of agency she had lacked before, empowering her to choose herself without guilt or justification. Whether her relationship with Brooke would ultimately survive remained uncertain, a question without a clear or easy answer, but for the first time, Katie recognized that the answer did not have to define her worth or dictate her future. What mattered now was her commitment to her own well-being, her willingness to listen to her heart when it spoke softly rather than waiting for it to scream, and her courage to walk away from anything that threatened to push her back toward the edge she had already come so terrifyingly close to falling over. In that resolve, forged in the aftermath of rage, betrayal, and fear, Katie found the fragile beginnings of peace, not because everything was fixed, but because she finally understood that her life, her health, and her heart were worth protecting at all costs.